Now, when you go to university and study like Western history, often it starts here with the Minoans and the Mycenaeans. These are the peoples who would, after the Bronze Age collapse, kind of recuperate and gather together with some other peoples around the Aegean Sea and constitute who we understand to be the Greeks. I don't know very much, and we don't know very much about these peoples, but, and maybe even the ancient Greeks themselves had a limited understanding. But Homer and the stories of the Iliad and the Odyssey are about these peoples and their, pretty mysterious collapse around the year 1200 or so BCE. And so the story of the fall of Troy is like a mythologized connection that we and the Greeks still have with that. As you can see, they had their architecture, they had their own mythology and their own writing systems. I don't think they've really quite been translated, and certainly they haven't been widely or reliably understood and disseminated. I think there was like a reconstruction of a Minoan fresco that turned out to be like perhaps relatively inaccurate, or at least not done perfectly. Regardless, what we do know is that around 8 or 900s BCE, what we now know is like the ancient Greeks, the many peoples living in and around the Aegean Sea, whatever you call this place, the Peloponnesus, Ionia, Thrace, etc., you would get the percolations of what would become one of the most famous and one of the most noteworthy cultures in human history, the ancient Greeks. Historians talk about firstly an archaic period, which I think is the most interesting. I think it has some of the most powerful writing and the most interesting poetry and philosophy, namely, Homer, Hesiod, Sappho and the lyric poets, the pre-Socratic philosophers. They're really important. Basically, they constitute, especially around centers like Miletus, which is on the western coast of Ionia in Turkey today, and also as far west as Sicily. You have people like Thales and Pythagoras starting to basically gather the knowledge of the Babylonians and the Egyptians, also potentially maybe like the Hittites. I didn't really talk about them. And they gathered all this learning together and kind of put it into one place, which is what we understand, I think, very poorly and simplistically as like the dawn of philosophy. I don't know how it's the beginning of philosophy if one of their primary innovations was combining what had already been there, but needless to say, it's still a very interesting and important historical moment. People like Heraclitus and Parmenides are still, really important philosophers for people who study philosophy to this day. And perhaps one of the innovations of somebody like Plato was that Athens, which is situated between Miletus and Sicily, became another place where even that knowledge was then gathered and synthesized. Even the pre-Socratic Greek philosophers had their knowledge, gathered in one place, namely Athens, and synthesized in the writings of Plato. That's an oversimplification of Plato, but it does help us, understand how these ideas, traveled and moved between geographical locations. That's why I shared with you the map. That's part of the picture too. Another interesting thing regarding the epics of Homer is that if you see here in this book, the Greek epic cycle by these scholars, there apparently were epic poems that Homer wrote, or that were Homeric, whatever exactly that means, that were basically like prequels to the Iliad and the Odyssey, so that there would have been, as many as like 3 or 9 Iliads and Odysseys for the archaic Greeks, and perhaps older, and that sadly only the Iliad and Odyssey have come down to us. We do know, at least, and I'd have to read this book, the Greek epic cycle, to really understand what I'm even talking about here, but we do know like pieces of the story, like, the whole episode with Paris and having to, say which of the 3 goddesses is most beautiful. These stories have come down to us in other ways, but I think it's really cool to imagine, what if there was like a 3rd epic poem to go along with the Iliad and the Odyssey, a prequel to the Iliad. I think that would be really cool. If you've heard about ancient Greece at all, though, you've probably heard about the classical period, especially centered around Athens and its artistic and philosophical flourishing, as well as its empire. The history of the Greeks basically revolves around 2 wars. The Persian Wars, where the Persian Empire, a very famous and important culture came and invaded the Greeks. The Greeks, especially with the help of the Athenians and the Spartans, etc., basically fended them off and then got arrogant. Basically, the Athenians created an empire and angered all the other Greeks. I'm very much oversimplifying it. Everything, causing the Peloponnesian War, which basically destroyed Greece, or weakened it to then be conquered by Macedon and Rome, etc. But there was a brief period in there where the Greek playwrights, especially centered around Athens, Sophocles, Aeschylus, Euripides, Aristophanes, etc., and then famously the Greek philosophers, Plato, Aristotle, but also their teachers and students, of which there were many, had a bit of a cultural flourishing before their empire dissolved into war and faded away. I think, though, what's important to understand about that little moment of cultural flourishing is that, as we've established, it's the culmination of the cultural contributions of the archaic Greeks in the centuries prior, building up to and maybe leading to this final flourishing of Plato and Aristotle, but they were standing on the shoulders of the giants of the pre-Socratics and Homer and everything else, kind of like how, Renaissance Europe was standing on the shoulders of classical Athens and Rome.